They only ever saw me as the poor girl, the family charity case. At the annual Davenport family meeting, my cousin Leo laughed in my face, offering me pity money because I couldn't afford a real house. They all chuckled. What they didn't know was that my little computer job had made me their landlord. I just smiled, waited for him to finish his speech, and then slid a contract across the polished mahogany table. Speaking of houses, I said, I believe I own this one. My name is Aurora Davenport, and this is the story of how I served revenge so cold it froze their assets. Want to watch the whole empire crumble? Make sure to like this story and subscribe for the next chapter. Let me know what city you're reading from in the comments below. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, a day of the week that held no particular significance until that moment. It wasn't delivered by a mail carrier, nor was it sent electronically like any normal piece of correspondence in the 21st century. It was hand-delivered by a courier in a black suit who looked like he'd stepped out of a movie about the Secret Service. He handed me the envelope, murmured, "For Ms. Aurora Davenport," and departed without another word, leaving me standing in the doorway of my fourth-floor walk-up. The envelope itself was an act of aggression. It was made of cardstock so thick and creamy it felt like a slice of petrified wedding cake. My name was written in an elegant, looping calligraphy that must have cost more per letter than my last electricity bill. In the top left corner, embossed in gold foil, was the Davenport family crest, a snarling griffin clutching a bundle of arrows, a symbol of wealth so old and belligerent it was almost a parody. I closed the door, the silence of my small apartment a welcome shield. The place wasn't much, but it was mine. A single, open-plan room with a kitchenette, a bed tucked into an alcove, and a large desk that dominated the space. This desk was my entire world. 3 monitors, a custom-built processing tower humming quietly on the floor, and a mess of cables were the tools of my trade. To my family, I was a freelance data analyst. To my aunt, it meant I played on the computer. To me, it was the forge where I was crafting my armor. The Davenport family annual meeting. Attendance mandatory. This year, it was to be held at the estate, the ancestral home where my grandfather, Harrison Davenport, still ruled from a leather throne, his silence more potent than any speech. I sank into my office chair, the thick envelope feeling cold and heavy in my hands. Dread was a familiar flavor, a metallic tang on the tongue I'd learned to associate with my family. It tasted like every Christmas I'd been given a practical gift while my cousins unwrapped designer bags and keys to new cars. It tasted like my 16th birthday, when Aunt Margaret had patted my head and told me it was a shame I'd inherited my mother's simple looks instead of the Davenport bone structure. My mother, the family ghost, who had committed the unforgivable sin of marrying a kind, intelligent history professor instead of a man with a trust fund. For years, I had endured it. I'd perfected the art of becoming small, of blending into the opulent wallpaper, of nodding and smiling through their thinly veiled insults about my life, my apartment, my poverty. I let them see the struggling girl living in the city, the poor relation, the cautionary tale. It was the most important data set I had ever collected. Their arrogance, their blindness, their complete and utter underestimation of me. My father's last words to me, spoken in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fear, weren't about love or letting go. He'd gripped my hand, his knuckles white. "Don't let them break you, Rory," he'd whispered, his voice raspy. "Your mind is sharper than all of theirs combined. Use it, not for revenge, for victory." I looked from the invitation to the central monitor on my desk. It displayed a complex web of LLCs, holding companies, and debt acquisition portfolios. A silent, invisible empire built in the dark, fueled by caffeine and the phantom sting of 1,000 slights. Revenge, victory. The words were 2 sides of the same coin. I slid the invitation onto my desk. This year, dread had a new companion, anticipation. A low, thrilling hum that vibrated deep in my chest. I would go to the meeting. I would play my part as the poor girl won last time. And then, I would show them exactly what their cautionary tale had been doing while they weren't looking. This year would be the final act. The drive to the estate was a journey through time. The city's gritty, vibrant landscape slowly gave way to manicured suburbs, which in turn melted into the rolling, privately owned hills of Davenport territory. My 2018 Honda Civic, a monument to reliability and fiscal prudence, felt like a dinghy sailing into the harbor of a great naval fleet as I turned onto the long, winding driveway. It was flanked by ancient oaks, their branches forming a solemn canopy. Ahead, a parade of gleaming German sedans and a monstrously large SUV were parked in a neat semicircle on the gravel expanse before the house. Leo's new Porsche was positioned front and center, its obnoxious racing yellow paint screaming for attention. The estate didn't look like a home. It looked like a museum that had reluctantly agreed to house a family. Stone walls, ivy-crawled and imposing, rose to a slate roof punctuated by a forest of chimneys. As I parked my humble Civic at the far edge of the gravel lot, I felt the familiar weight of the place settle on my shoulders. It was a house built to remind you of your own insignificance. The heavy oak door was opened by a butler who had been in my family service since before I was born. His face, a mask of professional courtesy, registered a flicker of something. Surprise? Pity. Before smoothing over. "Ms. Aurora, welcome." He led me into the grand foyer, where the air was thick with the scent of lemon polish and my Aunt Margaret's overpowering floral perfume. She emerged from the drawing room, a vision in a silk dress the color of champagne, her diamonds catching the light from the cathedral-like window above the staircase. "Aurora, darling," she said, her voice a smooth, cool melody. She glided forward and offered an air kiss that landed a full 6 inches from my cheek. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, performed their ritualistic scan, from my simple black dress down to my practical leather flats and back up. A faint, almost imperceptible curl of her lip told me I had once again failed the unspoken dress code. "So glad you could make it out of the city." The pause was a perfectly aimed dart. "It's good to see you, Aunt Margaret," I replied, my voice even. My cousin Leo bounded out of the room behind her, a broad, handsome man who wore his entitlement like a custom-tailored suit. He was holding a glass of amber liquid that was surely older and more expensive than my car. "Rory," he boomed, clapping me on the shoulder with a little too much force. "Still driving that little thing?" He gestured vaguely in the direction of the parking area. "It's cute. Reliable, I'm sure." "It gets me where I need to go, Leo," I said with a small, practiced smile. He laughed, a loud, hearty sound that was meant to convey effortless charm but always struck me as performative. That's the spirit. I was guided into the drawing room, a cavernous space filled with priceless antiques and portraits of stern-faced Davenport's long dead. Their painted eyes seemed to follow me, judging. Seated in a high-backed wing chair by the unlit fireplace was my grandfather, Harrison Davenport. He wasn't a large man, but he possessed a density that seemed to bend the room around him. He watched me approach over the rim of his teacup, his gaze sharp and analytical. He was the source of all this, the architect of the dynasty, a man who had built a real estate empire with a combination of shrewd genius and utter ruthlessness. "Grandfather," I said, inclining my head. He gave a curt, single nod. "Aurora." That was all. He said nothing more, simply returning to his silent observation as other cousins and their spouses filtered in, filling the room with the loud, cheerful chatter of the wealthy and unworried. They greeted me with varying degrees of condescension, from pitying smiles to outright dismissal as they turned to talk about ski trips to Gstaad and the trouble with finding good help for their summer homes. I found a seat in a corner, took a glass of sparkling water, and began my final performance as the family ghost. I watched. I listened. I waited. The formal meeting convened, as always, in the grand dining room. The table was a vast, polished ocean of mahogany that could have comfortably seated 30. I was placed, as always, near the far end, a satellite in the Davenport solar system. Grandfather Harrison sat at the head, a silent, brooding planet, with his heir apparent, Leo, at his right hand. Leo stood, puffed with self-importance, to begin his presentation. He clicked a button on a small remote, and a screen descended from a hidden recess in the ceiling. The logo for Davenport Holdings filled the screen. As you can see from the Q4 projections, Leo began, gesturing to a slide filled with colorful but ultimately meaningless charts. We've had another banner year. We successfully acquired the Heston building downtown and leveraged its portfolio to expand our commercial footprint in the waterfront district. He spoke for 20 minutes, spouting business jargon he'd clearly memorized from a motivational seminar. He talked about synergy and disrupting the market and aggressive growth strategies. I listened quietly, my analyst's brain effortlessly deconstructing his bloated figures. He was confusing revenue with profit, ignoring depreciation on their older assets, and completely failing to mention the dangerous amount of debt they'd taken on to finance their aggressive growth. It was a house of cards, painted gold. When he finished, a smattering of polite applause went around the table. He beamed, soaking it in before taking his seat. Then Aunt Margaret cleared her throat, and the room fell silent. She fixed her gaze on me, her expression a masterclass in feigned compassion. Now, she began, her voice dripping with counterfeit honey, onto a more delicate family matter. Aurora, dear. Every head turned in my direction. The spotlight was on. We all know how hard you're working, trying to make your own way. And we admire your independence. The word hung in the air, redefined to mean failure. But we're family, she continued, and we take care of our own. We can't bear the thought of you struggling in that little apartment. So, the family council has decided to help. Leo slid a familiar, cream-colored envelope across the table toward me. It stopped a few feet from my plate. We've put together a gift for you, Rory, he said, his voice softer now, oozing paternalistic concern. A little something to help you with a down payment on a proper home. A small condo, perhaps. Something secure. The humiliation was exquisite, a perfectly crafted poison. It wasn't just charity, it was a public declaration of my status. They weren't just giving me money, they were reinforcing the narrative that I was helpless without them. I could feel the eyes of my cousins on me, their expressions a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction. I looked at the envelope, then back at my aunt and cousin. I gave them a small, polite smile. That's incredibly generous of you, I said, my voice steady. But I can't accept it. Leo let out a short, disbelieving laugh. He looked around the table as if to say, "Can you believe this?" He leaned forward, his elbows on the pristine white tablecloth. "What's the matter, Rory?" he asked, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can't even afford a real house." He chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that was quickly echoed by others. "Don't worry, poor girl. We'll take care of you." The room filled with laughter. Not cruel, roaring laughter, but something far worse. The light, dismissive chuckles of people who believed they were doing a good deed for a pathetic creature. They were laughing at the poor girl. Their poor girl. And in the face of their collective, condescending mirth, I did something I had never done before. I didn't flush with shame. I didn't look down at my hands. I didn't stammer a defense. I smiled. It wasn't the small, practiced smile of polite deflection they were used to. This was a real smile, slow and deliberate, that started in my eyes and spread to my lips. It was a smile of profound, secret, and absolute satisfaction. It was the smile of a chess player who sees a checkmate in 12 moves that her opponent hasn't even begun to contemplate. The laughter around the table faltered, dying out in confused, awkward spurts. My smile, in its serene confidence, was not part of the script. Their insults, which had once felt like stones, now felt like mist. Poor girl. The words echoed in my head, but they had lost their power. They were describing a character I had played for years, and the play was about to end. My mind flashed back to a greasy spoon diner 3 years ago, seated across from Ben, my late father's best friend and my secret mentor. Ben was a retired financial forensics investigator with eyes that saw through spreadsheets and into the souls of corporations. He was the one who had helped me manage the small life insurance policy my father had secretly maintained. "They're sharks, Rory," he'd told me, stirring his coffee. And you don't fight sharks by trying to be a prettier fish. You learn to be a different kind of shark. He had slid a file across the table. Davenport Holdings is overleveraged. They look like an oak tree, but their roots are shallow, rotted with debt. They buy flashy, high-profile properties, but their cash flow is a nightmare. That was the beginning. While Leo was buying Porsches, I was using my father's seed money to make small, savvy investments in tech startups nobody had heard of. One of them, a data security firm, was bought out by a major corporation, and my initial 5-figure investment turned into 7.
It was the seed of my war chest.
While Aunt Margaret was hosting charity luncheons, I was spending my nights becoming an expert in commercial real estate law, debt instruments, and shell corporations. I formed AD Enterprises, LLC, an entity as anonymous and unassuming as I was. Through it, I began my quiet campaign. I didn't go after Davenport Holdings directly. That would have been too obvious. Following Ben's advice, I went after their creditors. I started buying up the debt of the smaller, more vulnerable lenders they relied on. I became a ghost in the financial system, a rumor on balance sheets. The final piece had fallen into place just last month. Their primary lender, a mid-size investment bank, had overextended itself and was quietly acquired. And I, through AD Enterprises, was the one who acquired them. I brought my focus back to the polished dining room, to the confused and wary faces of my family. They thought this was about a condo. They thought they were offering me a lifeline. They had no idea I was the ocean that was about to swallow their ship. My smile remained, a silent testament to the years of work, the lonely nights, the unwavering focus. My father had told me to aim for victory, and victory was finally at hand. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable. Aunt Margaret finally broke it, her voice regaining its sharp edge. Well, if that is all, I believe this meeting is adjourned. She was reasserting control, dismissing me and my baffling smile as an unpleasant anomaly. The family members began to stir, the scraping of chairs a welcome noise to break the tension. They were ready to move on to coffee and dessert, to forget the awkwardness and retreat to their comfortable reality. But I wasn't finished. "Excuse me," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room with the clean precision of a scalpel. "Actually, there's one more item on the agenda." Every single person froze. They turned to look at me, their expressions ranging from irritation to outright disbelief. I had never, in the entire history of these meetings, added something to the agenda. I was an attendee, an observer, a piece of furniture. I was not a participant. Slowly, I pushed my chair back and stood up. I reached down for the simple, unassuming tote bag at my feet, a bag they'd probably assumed held a paperback and a spare pair of cheap shoes. From it, I withdrew a sleek, black leather portfolio. It was modern, minimalist, and exuded a quiet professionalism that was utterly at odds with the poor girl persona they had so carefully constructed for me. The portfolio was the first piece of evidence that their data was wrong. I walked the length of the table, my practical flats making no sound on the priceless oriental rug. I could feel their eyes on me, a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. I stopped when I reached the center, directly across from Leo and beside my grandfather's imposing chair. I placed the portfolio on the table. The sound of the soft leather hitting the polished mahogany was a soft, definitive thud. It was a sound of substance, a sound of finality. I looked directly at Leo, whose face was a mask of arrogant confusion. "Leo," I began, my voice calm and clear, "you were just talking about the crown jewel of your portfolio, the acquisition you were so proud of." I let the statement hang in the air for a beat. "The apartment building on Elm Street. The one where Aunt Margaret keeps a penthouse. The one where you and your sister and cousin Robert all live." I paused, letting them all absorb the reference. Then I unzipped the portfolio. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, professionally bound document, its cover bearing the seal of a prestigious downtown law firm. I slid it into the center of the table. "I have the purchase agreement here," I announced to the silent, staring room. "The sale of the holding company that owned it was finalized this morning. The air in the dining room became a physical thing, thick, heavy, and unbreathable. The only sound was the faint, aristocratic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each second landing like a hammer blow on the anvil of the silence. Every eye was fixed on the document I had placed on the table, a dark rectangle on the sea of polished mahogany. It was a foreign object, an artifact from a world they did not understand, and it had brought their own world to a complete, shuddering halt. Leo, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and confusion, was the first to move. His chair scraped harshly against the floor as he lunged forward and snatched the document. His movements were clumsy, robbed of their usual athletic grace. He held the contract with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the first page, then frantically flipping to the signature blocks at the end. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving a sickly, pallid gray. The blood drained from his cheeks as if a plug had been pulled at the base of his neck. "What is this?" he choked out, his voice a hoarse whisper. "AD Enterprises, LLC. What the hell is this, Rory? Some kind of joke." "I don't joke about business, Leo," I said, my voice cutting through the silence, as cold and clear as ice water. "Read it carefully. You're a businessman. You should understand the language." His eyes darted back to the page, his lips moving silently as he tried to process the legal jargon. He saw the names, the labyrinth of numbered holding companies and investment vehicles his own lawyers had created to minimize tax liability. And he saw the final signature, the one that mattered, the president of the firm that had executed the final acquisition of the parent company's debt. AD Enterprises, LLC. This isn't possible," Aunt Margaret stammered, her hand fluttering to the diamonds at her throat. "We would know. Someone would have told us." "Would you?" I asked, my gaze sweeping the table. "You owned shares in a company. That company was held by another company. That parent company was financed by a line of credit from an investment bank. You didn't pay attention to that bank's failing health. You didn't notice when it was quietly restructured and its assets, including its portfolio of commercial debt, were sold off. I did. I let that sink in before delivering the final, inescapable truth. My voice was devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. My holding company, AD Enterprises, now owns the controlling interest in the bank that holds the deed to your building. Which means, for all intents and purposes," I paused, looking from Leo's ashen face to Margaret's trembling lips, "I own the building you all live in." A collective gasp went through the room. Someone dropped a silver fork, and the clatter was deafening. But I wasn't looking at them. My eyes were on my grandfather. Harrison Davenport had not moved a muscle. He was still seated at the head of the table, his teacup resting in its saucer. He was not looking at the contract, or at his hysterical daughter, or at his defeated grandson.
He was looking at me.
And in the depths of his cold, calculating eyes, I saw something I had never seen before directed at me, a flicker of sharp, undisguised, and profound respect. And then, the corner of his thin mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. The silence shattered. It wasn't a gradual return to sound, but an instantaneous explosion of chaos, as if a bomb had detonated in the center of the room. "Fraud!" Aunt Margaret shrieked, her voice cracking into an ugly, high-pitched screech. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her face contorted. "This is illegal. You tricked us. Leo, call the lawyers. Call the police." Leo, jolted into action by his mother's hysteria, slammed the contract down on the table. "She's right. You can't do this. We'll sue you into oblivion, Rory. We'll take everything. What little you have, anyway." The threat was automatic, a reflex, but it lacked its usual venom. It was the desperate roar of a wounded animal. I remained standing, my hands clasped loosely behind my back. I let their accusations fly, a storm of impotent fury. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "On what grounds would you sue?" I asked when there was a momentary lull for them to draw breath. "For conducting a series of legal, arm's-length transactions on the open market? For having better analysts than you? For reading the fine print on the loan agreements you signed?" I turned my attention to Leo. You were sloppy. You were so focused on the glory of the acquisition, you used the Elm Street building as collateral for nearly everything else. You signed a personal guarantee against a balloon payment you had no liquid assets to cover. All of this is in public filings if you know where to look. It turns out, I added, with the slightest touch of ice, that playing on the computer can be very informative. The reference hit its mark. Leo flinched as if I'd slapped him. This is my family's legacy, Margaret cried, tears of rage now streaming down her cheeks, ruining her perfect makeup. My father built it from nothing. You have no right. Your father built it with ruthless efficiency, I countered, my voice hardening for the first time. I glanced at my grandfather, who was still watching the scene unfold with an unnerving calm. He never let sentiment cloud his judgment. He would have seen a competitor as over-leveraged as you were, and he would have crushed them without a second thought. The only difference is, he wouldn't have expected it to come from someone sitting at his own table. I had used their own tactics against them. The predatory leveraging, the exploitation of legal loopholes, the cold and merciless execution of a business deal. I had learned the Davenport way, not from their lessons, but from their mistreatment. My other cousins were a mixture of terrified and bewildered. Some were whispering frantically to each other. Others were just staring at me as if I had grown a second head. They were the collateral damage, the comfortable passengers on a luxury liner that had just been torpedoed by the ship's forgotten cabin girl. I had said my piece. The seeds of chaos were well and truly sown. I picked up my simple tote bag from the floor. I believe this meeting is adjourned, I said, turning my aunt's own words back on her. And without another glance, I turned and walked out of the lion's den, the sounds of their outrage and confusion fading behind me. The war had begun, and the first battle was a decisive, stunning victory. Stepping out of the grand oak doors of the estate was like surfacing for air after being held underwater for a lifetime. The cool night air was a balm on my skin, sharp and clean and smelling of damp earth and freedom. I walked across the gravel to my Honda, the crunch of my footsteps the only sound. The lineup of luxury cars seemed like relics of a fallen empire, gaudy and useless. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I was halfway to the city when my phone, which I'd left on silent, began to vibrate against the passenger seat. Then it vibrated again, and again, a frantic, ceaseless buzzing. I didn't need to look. I knew. Back in my apartment, I kicked off my shoes and plugged the phone into its charger. The screen lit up with a dizzying cascade of notifications. 19 missed calls from Leo, Margaret, and various other cousins. 37 text messages. A dozen voicemails. I sank into my office chair, took a sip of cold water, and pressed play on the first one. It was my cousin Amelia, her voice trembling and on the verge of tears. Rory? It's Amelia.
Please call me.
Is it true? About the apartments? Oh my God. Rory, what's happening?
Click.
I deleted it and played the next one.
Leo.
The sound was distorted, filled with fury. You think you're clever, don't you? You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with. My lawyers will tear you apart. You will end up with nothing. Nothing. You pathetic little dash, click. I deleted it. There were more. A chorus of pleading, threats, and confusion. It was just noise. An hour later, there was a furious, insistent pounding on my apartment door. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor. It was the entitled banging of someone who had never been denied entry anywhere in their life. I looked through the peephole. It was Aunt Margaret, her face pale and strained under the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, her silk dress looking absurdly out of place. I opened the door. She pushed past me into the room, her eyes wide as she took in my space. I saw it through her lens, the single, functional room, the neatly made bed in its alcove, the bookshelf filled not with trinkets, but with textbooks on economics and law, the stark, powerful command center of my desk. Her face registered a profound, disorienting shock. This wasn't the pathetic, squalid little hovel she had imagined. It was the clean, organized, and ruthlessly efficient den of a predator. There was no chaos here. There was only control. How could you? She finally whispered, her bravado gone, replaced by a raw, brittle anger. After everything this family has given you, what did this family give me? I asked, closing the door softly. A seat at the far end of the table?
Pity?
A convenient target for your condescension? You didn't give me anything. You provided me with motivation. Your grandfather will disown you, she spat. He can't, I said simply. To disown me, he'd have to have some power over me. You seem to be confused about the current power dynamic, Aunt Margaret. I'm not the one living in a building owned by someone else. That struck her silent. The reality of her situation, her vulnerability, was dawning on her. Her threats, her social standing, her name, they meant nothing here. They were a foreign currency. She looked around my apartment again, at the powerful computer, at the tidy, Spartan surroundings. She was looking for a weakness, a chink in the armor, and she was finding nothing but steel. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. The fight went out of her, leaving behind a bitter, bewildered old woman. What do you want, Aurora? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What is the point of all this? Respect, I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. And my mother's legacy. You called her simple. You called me poor. You were wrong on both counts. I opened the door for her. She looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with a new, terrifying emotion, fear. And then she left, her retreat down the hallway far less grand than her arrival. 2 days passed in a tense quiet. The barrage of calls and texts slowed to a trickle as the family huddled together, presumably with their lawyers, trying to find a way out of the cage I had built for them. I spent the time preparing for my next move, running diagnostics on the tangled mess of Davenport Holdings' finances. The reality was even worse than my initial analysis had suggested. They were on the verge of total collapse. On the third day, a text message appeared that was different from the others. It wasn't from Leo or Margaret. It was from my younger cousin, Maya. Maya was the quiet one, a budding artist who had been dismissed by the family even more thoroughly than I had. They saw her passion for painting as a frivolous, pointless waste of a Davenport education. Can we talk? The text read, just you and me. Coffee? I was cautious, but my instincts told me this was not a trap. Maya had never been part of the core group that tormented me. She was, like me, an outsider on the inside. Okay, I typed back. The grind on 4th Street. 1 hour. I chose a neutral location, a busy coffee shop far from both my apartment and their territory. I got there first and chose a small table in the back. Maya arrived exactly on time, looking nervous. She clutched her worn leather satchel to her chest like a shield. Thanks for meeting me, Rory, she said, sliding into the chair opposite me. She wouldn't meet my eye. Of course, Maya. What's on your mind? Is it all true? She asked, her voice low. About the building? About everything? I nodded slowly. It's all true. A strange look crossed her face. It wasn't anger or fear. It looked impossibly like relief. She finally lifted her head and met my gaze, and her eyes were filled with a startling, fierce awe. Good, she breathed out. They're losing their minds. Leo is screaming at everyone. Margaret is weeping in her room. The lawyers told them yesterday that you have them completely cornered. That every contract is ironclad. She leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. They don't know that I know how bad it really is, Rory. I help Grandfather Harrison with his personal paperwork sometimes. He doesn't trust Leo with the details. The real details. My curiosity piqued. And what are the real details? They're broke, she said, the word landing with quiet force. Not just cash poor, I mean truly, fundamentally broke. Leo's last few acquisitions were disasters. He was hiding the losses in shell companies. The whole thing. Davenport Holdings, it's a facade. Grandfather has been selling off his personal assets for months just to cover the interest payments. He knew it was all going to collapse. I think, she said, her eyes wide with the enormity of her realization. He was just waiting to see who would be left standing when it did. Her confession confirmed everything my data had suggested. The empire wasn't a mighty fortress I had sieged. It was a rotten structure that I had simply pushed, and it had crumbled. Maya's revelation didn't just give me confirmation. It gave me something I hadn't expected.
An ally.
Someone else who saw the truth behind the gilded lies. "Why are you telling me this, Maya?" I asked quietly. She took a deep breath. "Because you did what I've always dreamed of doing. You stood up to them. You showed them that their money and their name doesn't make them invincible. Whatever you're planning to do next," she said, her gaze firm, "I want to help." Maya's intel was the final piece of the puzzle. It armed me not just with legal and financial power, but with the undeniable truth of the family's situation. They had no ground to stand on, no cards left to play. It was time for the next meeting. But this time, it would be on my terms. I didn't send a gilded invitation. I sent a simple, formal email from my corporate address. The subject line was blunt: mandatory meeting regarding the future of Davenport Holdings. The address provided was not the estate. It was a skyscraper in the heart of the financial district, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that scraped the sky. The meeting was set for the following afternoon, in the main boardroom of AD Enterprises. I was there first, of course. The room was the antithesis of the Davenport dining room. Instead of dark wood and oil paintings of dead ancestors, it was all clean lines, chrome, and panoramic windows offering a stunning, commanding view of the city. At the center was a massive black granite table. I took my seat at its head. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Chun, stood quietly by the window, a tablet in her hand. They arrived together, a grim, defeated procession. Grandfather Harrison came in first, leaning on his cane, but his eyes were sharp. He surveyed the room, then me, and gave another one of his curt, almost imperceptible nods before taking a seat to my right. Then came Margaret and Leo, their faces masks of resentment and fear. The other peripheral cousins followed, shuffling in like scolded children. They took their seats, the silence thick with tension. They looked small in this room, their old-world finery clashing with the stark, modern power of their surroundings. They were no longer the lions in their den. They were the ones who had been summoned. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely, irrevocably inverted. I let them sit in the silence for a full minute, allowing the reality of their new position to settle deep in their bones. I looked at each of them in turn, my gaze steady and unreadable. Finally, I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool, smooth surface of the granite table. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice echoing slightly in the vast, quiet room. "I know the past few days have been disruptive." I paused, letting the understatement hang in the air. "Now," I continued, my voice all business, "let's talk about the future of Davenport Holdings. Or more accurately, what we're going to do with what's left of it." The only sound in the boardroom was the faint hum of the climate control system. My words, "what's left of it," hung in the air, a stark and brutal epitaph for their delusions. Leo's face was a thundercloud of impotent rage. Aunt Margaret looked as if she had swallowed acid. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to my lawyer. Miss Chun, without a word, walked the length of the table, her heels clicking with sharp authority on the polished concrete floor. She placed a thin folder in front of each family member. "Before we discuss the future, we must address the present," I stated, my voice even and dispassionate. "Ms. Chin will brief you on the immediate operational changes." Ms. Chin began, her tone crisp and devoid of any emotion. "Effective immediately, a full, independent forensic audit of Davenport Holdings and all its subsidiary LLCs will commence. All executive accounts are frozen pending the results of this audit. Mr. Leo Davenport and Mrs. Margaret Shaw," she said, not even looking at them, "are hereby relieved of all executive duties and signing authority. Your corporate access will be revoked at the close of this meeting." "You can't do this." Leo finally exploded, slamming his hand on the granite table. The sound was flat and dead in the acoustically designed room. "I am the CEO. You are the CEO of a company that is functionally insolvent and will be in default on its major covenants by the end of the fiscal quarter, Miss Chen countered without missing a beat. My client's firm, AD Enterprises, as the primary creditor, is exercising its legal right to install new management to protect its investment. My investment. The words were so simple, so clean. Ms. Chun continued, placing a second, thicker document in front of those it concerned. Leo, Margaret, and 2 other cousins. Furthermore, here are the new lease agreements for your residences at the Elm Street property. As the previous subsidized leases were executive perks tied to your employment, they are now void. These are standard 1-year leases. Leo ripped his open. His eyes bulged. This is triple what I was paying. This is extortion. It's the market rate, I said calmly. It's the same rent any other tenant in the building would be expected to pay. You have 30 days to sign, or the eviction process will begin. This is not a negotiation. It is a notification. My gaze swept across the terrified faces. They were finally beginning to understand. This wasn't a family squabble. It wasn't about feelings or history.
It was a corporate restructuring.
A hostile takeover. And I was not the scorned niece seeking an apology. I was the new owner, setting the terms of their surrender. Aunt Margaret looked at me, her eyes pleading for the first time in her life. Aurora, please. We're family. You taught me what family means, Aunt Margaret, I replied, my voice as cold and hard as the table between us. You taught me that family is a hierarchy based on power and wealth. The only thing that has changed is my position in it. Throughout the entire exchange, Grandfather Harrison remained silent. He watched me, his expression unreadable, as I dismantled the empire he had built and his children had ruined. He did not object. He did not intervene. His silence was the most powerful endorsement in the room, a quiet concession that the old reign was over and the new one had begun. After the shell-shocked remnants of my family had filed out of the boardroom, a cloud of despair hanging over them, my grandfather lingered. He pushed himself to his feet with the help of his cane and looked at me. My office, he said, his voice a low rumble. It was a request, not a command. I led him from the cold, impersonal boardroom to my private office. It was a corner suite with the same breathtaking views, but it was warmer, more personal. One wall was a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf filled with books on history, finance, and art, a nod to both my parents. He walked slowly to the window, looking down at the city spread below us like a circuit board. I built this company with steel and fire, Aurora, he said, his back still to me. I took risks that would make lesser men tremble. I was ruthless because I had to be. I wanted to build something that would last. A dynasty. He turned to face me, his eyes filled with a weary disappointment. My own children, they are soft. They inherited my money, but not my mettle. Your Aunt Margaret cares only for the appearance of wealth. Your uncle, for the comfort of it. And Leo. He sighed, a sound like gravel shifting. Leo is a peacock. All bright feathers and a loud squawk, but no substance. He was running my company into the ground, and he was too arrogant to even see it. He took a step closer, leaning on his cane. His gaze was intense. I saw the steel in you when you were just a girl. I saw your father's sharp mind and your mother's quiet resilience. But you hid it. You made yourself small. And for that I was disappointed. Not because you were poor as they all thought, but because I thought you were wasting the gift. I thought my legacy would die with me. It was the most he had ever said to me in my entire life. A confession and an explanation all in one. I knew the company was dying, he continued. I was watching the numbers. I knew it was only a matter of time before the whole house of cards came down. I was just waiting to see what would happen. Who would be left? He gave a dry, humorless chuckle. I never imagined the person to take it all would be you.
You didn't just survive, child.
You conquered. He walked over to my large, clean desk. Ms. Chun had left a single file folder for him. He opened it. Inside was a document transferring his majority voting shares in the nearly defunct Davenport holdings to AD Enterprises. It was the final nail in the coffin of the old guard and the legal foundation of my new empire. He took a pen from his pocket, a heavy, gold fountain pen I'd seen him use my whole life. He signed his name with a steady, practiced hand. He slid the document across the desk to me. They thought they were the lions and you were the lamb, he said, his voice low. How foolish. They never realized they were living in a jungle you had already claimed. He looked at me, his eyes clear. The dynasty is yours now. Do not be merciful. My grandfather's advice was a reminder of the world he came from, a world of black and white, conquer or be conquered decisions. But I was not him. My revenge wouldn't be complete by simply destroying them. It would be complete by proving I was a better leader than they ever could have been. And that meant dispensing judgment, but also, where it was earned, mercy. I met with Leo and Margaret in the same boardroom a week later. They looked diminished, aged by the sudden loss of power. They had brought a lawyer this time, a man who looked nervous and out of his depth. Here are your options, I said, sliding a 2-page document across the table. Option 1, a severance package. It is fair, based on your years of service. It comes with a strict non-disclosure and non-compete agreement. You take it, you sign the papers, and you are free to go on with your lives. You will be comfortable, but you will no longer be Davenports in any business sense. I paused, then pushed a second document forward. Option 2, you can stay. Not as executives. Not as board members. I am creating a new archival department to organize the 70 years of Davenport Holdings history. I need a family historian. The salary is modest. The work is tedious. There is no authority. You will report to a manager I hire. It was a perfectly crafted punishment. I was offering them a choice between their pride and a paycheck. To Leo, who craved power, it was a public castration. To Margaret, who craved status, it was an unthinkable demotion. This is an insult. Leo snarled. It's an offer. I replied coolly. You have 24 hours to decide. They looked at each other, their faces a portrait of pure fury. I knew they would take the money. Their pride would never let them accept a role so far beneath them. My meeting with Maya was different. I met her in my office, not the boardroom. I gestured for her to sit on the comfortable sofa, not at the imposing desk. You took a great risk telling me what you did, I said. You showed loyalty not to the name, but to the truth. That's a quality I value. I just wanted to see them get what they deserved, she said quietly, looking at her hands. The old Davenport Holdings is being dissolved, I explained. I'm restructuring it, rebranding it. I want to build something that lasts, something with a conscience. Part of that is a new charitable foundation, focusing on funding public arts and preserving historic architecture. I want you to run it. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Me? But I'm an artist. I don't know anything about running a foundation. You have a passion for the arts, and you have integrity. I can hire people to teach you the rest, I said with a smile. I'm not offering you a job, Maya. I'm offering you a purpose that aligns with your passion. It's what you've always deserved. For the first time, I saw tears in her eyes. But these were not tears of anger or fear. They were tears of hope. For the others, their fate was tied to their past actions. The sycophants and mockers were given the same choice as Leo, a modest severance and an NDA. Those who had simply been bystanders, caught in the crossfire, were offered continued employment in non-critical roles, their leases honored under new, fair terms. I was not my grandfather. My judgment was not without mercy, but it was absolute. 6 months passed. The world settled into a new shape, one of my design. The shell of the old company was dismantled, its toxic assets fire-sold or written off. From its foundations, I built something new. I rebranded the company, shedding the old, tarnished name. We were now the Sterling Legacy Group. My mother's maiden name. It was a quiet tribute, a final victory for the woman they had scorned. My life was unrecognizable from what it had been a year ago. I moved out of my small apartment and into the penthouse at the Elm Street building, the one Aunt Margaret had been forced to vacate. It felt right, claiming the perch from which she had looked down on the world and on me. But my days were not spent hosting luncheons. They were a whirlwind of meetings, analysis, and decisions. I didn't run the company like my grandfather, through fear. And I didn't run it like Leo, through bluster and ego. I ran it like the data analyst I had always been, with precision, logic, and a clear-eyed view of the objective. But my objectives were different. I walked a construction site one afternoon, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and fresh paint. Sterling Legacy was funding the restoration of a historic library in a low-income neighborhood, a project Davenport Holdings would have bulldozed for luxury condos. My site manager, a grizzled man named Sal, shook his head in amazement. "In 30 years, I've never seen a developer do something like this," he said, gesturing to the intricate plasterwork our artisans were restoring. "This costs a fortune. You could have built 3 cheap apartment blocks for this price." "This is a better investment," I told him, looking up at the soaring, beautiful ceiling. "A legacy isn't just about what you own. It's about what you build." My revenge was no longer a burning fire in my gut. It had cooled into the solid, steel framework of my new life. It wasn't about watching my family fall. It was about proving that I could rise higher and build better. I had taken their power, their money, and their name. But instead of hoarding it like they had, I was using it to create something of value. I was proving, every single day, that the poor girl had more vision and integrity than their entire dynasty combined. That was a victory sweeter than any shouting match at a dinner table. 1 year to the day after the fateful family meeting, I sent out another round of invitations. Not thick, embossed cards, but elegant, simple emails. "You are cordially invited to the Sterling Legacy Group annual dinner." I didn't hold it at the estate, which now sat empty, a silent monument to a bygone era. I didn't hold it in my boardroom. I booked the private dining room of a new, critically acclaimed restaurant, one our group had helped finance. The room was modern, tasteful, and filled with light, its windows overlooking the beautifully restored library. The attendees were different. Grandfather Harrison was there, looking frilier but more at peace than I had ever seen him. He sat at my right hand, an elder statesman, a respected advisor. Maya was on my left, glowing with a confidence I had never seen in her before. Her arts foundation was a resounding success, earning praise throughout the city. A few of the other cousins were there, the ones who had accepted their new reality with humility. They were quiet, respectful, and gainfully employed. Leo and Margaret were absent. I had heard they'd taken their severance and moved to Florida, unable to bear living in a city where they were no longer royalty. Their chapter was closed. The meal was pleasant. The conversation centered on new projects, on the future. There was no undercurrent of resentment, no passive-aggressive jabs. There was only the calm, comfortable hum of a new kind of family, one forged not from obligation and entitlement, but from mutual respect and a shared purpose. As dessert was served, I stood up, tapping my glass for attention. The room fell silent. All eyes were on me. A year ago, in a different room, I had stood up to announce a hostile takeover. Now I stood as the undisputed head of the table. A year ago, I began, my voice steady. A lot of things changed. We let go of the past, of a legacy that was crumbling under its own weight. I looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes. Tonight, I want to thank you all for embracing the future, for your hard work, your loyalty, and your belief in building something that will truly last. I raised my glass. This is not about what we've lost, but about what we are creating together. To the Sterling Legacy Group. To Sterling Legacy, they echoed, their voices united. I took a sip of champagne, the taste crisp and clean. The ghost of the poor girl was gone forever, exorcised by success and the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman in full command of her destiny. My revenge was complete. Not because I had won, but because I had built something worthy of winning. The silence in the room this time was not one of shock or fear. It was the sound of a hard-won, peaceful, and prosperous new beginning. And so, the poor girl they once laughed at became the matriarch they now answer to. My grandfather's advice was to be ruthless, but I chose to offer my most bitter rivals, Leo and Margaret, a severance package, a quiet exit instead of complete ruin. But now I have to ask you all, was I too soft? Let me know in the comments what you would have done. Was my revenge just right, Or should I have followed my grandfather's advice and been more ruthless? I can't wait to read your opinions.